Let's talk about running backs that you need to be starting in week 8 of fantasy football. As always, we're going to break this up into 3 different categories: your smash starts, your solid starts, and your high risk, high reward starts. 9 total players, 3 categories. The guys on the screen right now are all obvious must start players. Get them in your lineup, keep them in your lineup. Let's start with the high risk, high reward category. First man up is Tyler Algier. I know he's the backup running back for the Falcons, but hear me out for a second. One lesson that we've learned so far this year in fantasy football is you start your running back when they're playing the Miami Dolphins, because the Dolphins' run defense is horrific. And yeah, Tyler Algier is not going to be the workhorse back on Atlanta. It's going to be Bijan Robinson. I understand, but 6 teams on bye, injuries everywhere. There's going to be a lot of desperate fantasy managers out there this week looking for anything. So I'm trying my best to give you guys some sneaky angles to score fantasy points this week and to win your matchup. We know Algier is one of the best backup running backs in the NFL, and he's shown flashes in a limited role and has a knack for scoring touchdowns, as he has 3 scores in 6 games. Not great overall, but good for a backup running back. And I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities in week 8 on a very run-heavy Atlanta offense that leads the league in rush attempts right now at 31.8 attempts per game. That's insane. And the Falcons should continue to lean on their run game, especially if Michael Penix Jr. is not able to play in week 8. But regardless, I think the Falcons have full command of this game, as Miami is looking like not only a terrible run defense, but just one of the worst teams in the NFL right now. So the Falcons probably going to have a positive game script, which means a lot of running the football with Bijan Robinson. Algier is going to have opportunities, and the Dolphins have allowed the most rushing yards in the league to running backs this season. So it would not shock me if Algier does fall into the end zone in week 8. He has an incredible matchup. He is still seeing some opportunities. And if they get up big, like, don't risk Bijan getting hurt, right? There might be an opportunity for Algier to play more than you think. So again, he's in the high risk, high reward category for a reason. But if you need a desperation play in your flex, I think Algier does have some upside. All right, moving on to our next guy, Isaiah Pacheco. The tides are kind of turning a little bit with Pacheco in Kansas City. It seems like he's earning that full-time role back, and that's really good if he's on your team, because this Kansas City offense right now is humming. They're red hot. Patrick Mahomes is playing out of his mind. And yeah, Pacheco hasn't looked great, right? He hasn't looked very efficient with his touches, but it doesn't really matter. When you're seeing 15 plus opportunities in each of his last 2 games, which that's what he's seeing, that's pretty nice. On one of the best offenses in football, you take it, especially in a weird year that it's been this season. You're grasping onto any type of production that you can get. And in week 7, 15 carries for 54 yards, got into the end zone for the first time this year. You like to see that. 12.4 fantasy points, not anything crazy. But that was also in a game where Kansas City benched their starters at the end of the 3rd quarter because they were crushing the Las Vegas Raiders. So I think that Pacheco is going to be in for another heavy workload on Monday Night Football against the Washington Commanders. And it could be a similar situation again. They could get up big early and then just not have to do anything, right? You hope that Pacheco is productive in that period of time, but if Jaden Daniels doesn't play in this game, I don't see how it's ultra competitive. Maybe they just run a ton with Pacheco, which would be nice. So if you have Isaiah, if you really need a running back to plug into your flex or into your RB2 spot, I do think he has a solid performance in week 8. All right, moving on to our next guy, Woody Marks, who obviously monitored the practice reports this week. It looked like he did get a little banged up at the end of the game in week 7, but not totally sure. If he's active, if he's playing, then he does have some flex value, because what we saw in week 7 was pretty encouraging from a usage standpoint. As we know, Houston was coming out of their bye week. Woody Marks is a rookie. You know, rookies tend to get that post-bye bump, and he got a little bit of that. Let's talk about it. 61% of the snaps. You like to see that. 10 of the 15 running back carries, 20 routes, 5 targets, involved in the passing game, 35 total yards, and a touchdown, 12.5 fantasy points. He was the RB16 on the week. Obviously, you would like to see him be more productive on the ground, but his involvement in the passing game, getting the touchdown at the end, was nice. He did outsnap Nick Chubb, who only saw 26% of the snaps. Now, this could be the nature of the game, which we know Houston was trailing for most of it. on Monday Night Football against the Seahawks. So maybe because they were in catch-up mode, Woody Marks was more involved because we know he's the pass down back. But it would not shock me either if Marks is just the guy in the backfield because Nick Chubb is just unfortunately not very good at football anymore. And this could be a big game in Week 8 for Marks in terms of in the receiving game because they could be without the Texans, that is. They could be without their number one wide receiver in Nico Collins, who is dealing with a concussion right now. So if he's out, who do they have on offense? Like, I know they have some young, talented receivers, but if CJ Stroud is under a lot of pressure, checking it down to Woody Marks could be something that happens early and often in Week 8. And the 49ers are a very beatable run defense who have allowed 3 receiving touchdowns to running backs so far this year. So Woody Marks does have some nice value coming off a nice usage game in Week 7. I think he is startable in your flex if you do need him. All right, moving on to our next category, solid starts. First guy up here is Chase Brown, who finally, if you drafted him, you finally got some sort of gratification, right? Maybe he's probably not on your team if you drafted him because you probably have a losing record, unfortunately. Hopefully you traded him away because you probably needed anyone to score fantasy points, something that Brown just wasn't doing, but it's really not his fault. Joe Burrow getting hurt kind of tanked that entire offense until Joe Flacco came to town, which we'll talk about in a second. But Week 7 for Brown, it was nice. 11 carries, 108 yards, 9.8 yards per carry, 12 fantasy points. Obviously, you would like more fantasy points there, but he passed the eye test, which is something he has not done all year long. He had a career high 101 yards after contact, 6 missed tackles forced, along with a 63% snap share, which was his highest since Week 4. We know Samaje Perine continues to be involved. It's super annoying. It doesn't look like he's going away. And while that performance by Brown, like we said, didn't translate into a ton of fantasy points, it's encouraging to see this Bengals offense that they can actually move the football because that was something that they could not do with Jake Browning. Joe Flacco looks much more serviceable, which is what we hoped for when they traded for him. I do think better days are ahead for Brown because the threat to throw with Flacco and Chase and Higgins is going to open up the running game for Brown. And I think it could happen as early as this week against the New York Jets, who just aren't that good on offense, defense. They rank 27th in terms of rushing yards allowed to running backs this year, as they've allowed 702 rushing yards. So you're starting Brown this week. I think you can feel pretty good about it. I think he is a nice buy low candidate as well before his schedule starts to get really easy. So Brown, I think, builds on a strong performance last week, carries it over, and it would not shock me if he scores a touchdown. All right, moving on to our next guy, Kimani Vidal, who's coming off a rough game after he went off the previous week against the Miami Dolphins, of course, but I would not be losing faith in Vidal just yet. He's still the Chargers' preferred RB1, and he showed it in Week 7, 65% of the snaps. He had 9 of the 10 running back carries, 29 routes, 5 targets. Hassan Haskins had 14 routes, 2 targets, and Vidal finished with 7.5 fantasy points. You don't love to see that, but the game script against the Colts was terrible. Chargers got down early, and they were just in catch-up mode the entire game, which resulted in some nice receptions for Vidal, but that was about it. I'm still taking away from this game the volume, which was super encouraging to see, and he's going to be busy again in Week 8 because we just found out that Hassan Haskins likely not going to play in this one as he deals with the hamstring injury. So, yeah, it's going to be the Vidal show. So you're betting on talent, you're betting on volume, you're betting on him being on a good offense in LA, and Joe Alt, the Chargers' best offensive lineman, looks set to return this week, which would be a huge boost for not only the run game, but for the pass game as well. And even in a tougher matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, who have allowed the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs this season, it's such a weird defense because some weeks they look great and then other weeks they look terrible. Like when they played the Pittsburgh Steelers and they gave up a ton of yards and a couple scores, I believe, to Kenneth Gainwell, right? Like Minnesota has always been better against the pass, at least this year, than the run. So I still do feel confident about starting Vidal this week because I don't think the matchup is as difficult as it looks, and he's going to get so much work. So if you really need him, he burned you last week, I would go back to the well and start him again. I do think he has a nice bounce back performance. All right, moving on to our next guy, DeAndre Swift, ladies and gentlemen, who has just come out of nowhere as of late. The RB6 in fantasy over the last 2 weeks, averaging 23.2 fantasy points per game, back-to-back 100-yard rushing performances. It appears Ben Johnson has figured out one thing on this offense, and that is the ground game. They still haven't looked great through the air, but they have been ultra efficient on the ground as of late. Strong offensive line play has definitely helped as this unit ranks top 5 in run block win rate. We do need to give some credit to Swift. Let's not give all the credit to the line and the scheme. He's been much better than normal, and he ranks over the last 2 weeks second in explosive run rate. You like to see that, behind only Devon Achane, and then second in yards before contact, which is more of a credit to the offensive line. But hey, we'll still give it to Swift. He has been impressive. He has passed the eye test as of late, and I think either way, you have to be riding the hot hand here. It is scary, though. I feel like you finally put Swift into your starting lineup, and then he's going to score 3 fantasy points. Let's hope that does not happen. But the matchup in Week 8, it shouldn't, because the Baltimore Ravens defense has been terrible. We know they are coming off a bye, so maybe they figured it out, but I'm guessing they haven't, as they've allowed the second most fantasy points to running backs per game this season. I do think Kyle Monangai, the rookie running back, is not going away. I do think he's going to be involved, but maybe they just run all over Baltimore. My only issue with that, though, is if Lamar Jackson does return this week, then they might get in a situation where they're down big early on offense, and then they have to throw more. So that would be my only caution. Yes, Swift can get it done in the passing game, but let's say they're down 21. They're not going to be dinking and dunking it to DeAndre. They're going to be pushing the ball downfield. So that would be my only concern with playing Swift. But again, situation of this week with injuries and buys, you still likely have to start him, and I do think he has a nice day in Week 8. All right, moving on to our next category, smash starts. First guy up is a guy who's been very disappointing, but I think he's going to start really turning it on the second half of the year, and that's Derrick Henry, who after Week 1, I had so much regret not drafting King Henry. I was kicking myself. I was like, gosh dang it, like this guy is an alien. He doesn't age. I was really beating myself up, because if you all remember against the Buffalo Bills, he was incredible. 169 yards, 2 touchdowns, 29.2 fantasy points. That was all in Week 1. But ever since that game, he's been a disappointment for the most part. And obviously, a lot of that isn't his fault. Lamar Jackson getting hurt. This offense without him has been an absolute disaster. And Lamar hasn't played since Week 4 when he got injured halfway through the game against the Kansas City Chiefs. And in result, Henry has scored 14 or less fantasy points in 5 out of 6 games this season. Hasn't been terrible, but not a guy you spent an early round 2, late round 1 pick on, right? You've been obviously hoping for more, especially after that Week 1 performance. But with Lamar hopefully set to return, we don't know for sure. In Week 8, Henry is in an absolute smash spot, coming off a bye against the Chicago Bears, who have allowed the 11th most fantasy points to running backs this season. You're obviously starting Henry. I'm here just to calm your nerves, ease your mind, that I think he has a huge game. I think he has a huge game with Lamar or not, to be honest with you, but he's going to have a monster game if Jackson does return. All right, moving on to our next guy, Breece Hall. I don't know how many more times I can have Hall on a start list before I just give up, because he continues week after week to just break our hearts and let us down. He's coming off another dud performance in Week 7, 11 carries, 38 yards, 3.5 yards per carry, 2 catches, 14 yards. You like that he got involved a little bit in the passing game, something that he didn't do at all the week prior, but 7.2 fantasy points. What do you do with that, right? Here's why I am optimistic for this week and why he's on this list. Tyrod Taylor taking over as QB1. No more Justin Fields, who's just been horrible this year. I feel like I've always been the guy to root for Justin Fields and to always give him the benefit of the doubt, but I'm done. I'm done with Fields. He's terrible. He can't run an offense. He doesn't know what he's doing out there. He looks lost. Tyrod Taylor, not like a Hall of Fame quarterback, but he's a sharp veteran, and it will be an upgrade for fantasy purposes. I think the veteran quarterback is going to be serviceable enough. If Garrett Wilson returns in this one, which I'm assuming he's going to be out again, I think Tyrod checks it down to Breece a ton in the passing game, which is what we want. Just get him more involved on the ground and through the air. He's your best player on offense at this point. I will say an important note is the usage has been weird between Hall and Isaiah Davis, as Hall saw 53% of the snaps in Week 7 and was basically splitting work with Davis. Not sure if this had something to do with Hall. He did get slightly banged up in Week 7. They were talking about maybe an ankle injury, but he did return. Head coach this week has already said that he should be okay. So I think regardless, though, the usage has been weird, but regardless, you're starting Hall in a really nice matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, who are allowing 30.9 PPR fantasy points per game to running backs this season. So it's a combination of Breece Hall still being a really talented player. He's going to see hopefully a ton of usage in a game where maybe they're trailing against this red hot, all of a sudden, Cincinnati Bengals offense, and they have no one with no Garrett Wilson. He needs to be the focal point of this offense this week. Tyrod Taylor hopefully can help them march down the field, maybe get into the red zone. Maybe Breece Hall sneaks into the end zone. That would be nice to see. I do think Hall is getting traded at some point, so buy low now, get him on your roster because he could be going to a contender, and that would be absolutely huge, depending on where he goes for fantasy, though. Like, if he goes to Kansas City, he's a top 5-6 running back for the rest of the year, easy. Like, it would just be insane. All right, moving on to our last guy, Cam Skatteman. Talk about a guy who's been really good this year. He's been sensational. He's the RB10 in fantasy, averaging 16.8 fantasy points per game. And he had a nice performance in week 7, 16 carries, 60 yards. Obviously, you would like him to be a little more efficient there, but you'll still take it because he had 3 receptions for 34 yards, got into the end zone on that nice receiving score from Jackson Dart. It was an impressive run after the catch. And of course, Skatteman was looking for contact after he scored. Like, he was 3 yards into the end zone and he was lowering his helmet, looking for contact. Like, you just got to absolutely love the dude. But he's been really fun to watch, and he's been really fun to have on your fantasy team. 18.4 fantasy points in week 7. And we like to see that. I mean, that's a strong performance against one of the best defenses in football in the Denver Broncos. So that's super encouraging. And Skatteboo's snaps did drop a little bit in this one to 60% as Tyrone Tracy was a little more involved, but I don't expect that to hold. Like, Skatteboo is the much better player than Tracy, and it's just way too valuable, way too important to this Giants offense. Like, he's just been way too good. Like, even if Cam is seeing 60% of the snaps going forward, he's still going to be highly productive, but I think that number probably is on the rise. Cam has just been so good as he ranks 3rd in missed tackles forced per attempt, 6th in yards after contact per attempt, and 90+ scrimmage yards in 5 straight games. He's going to continue to be the engine of this ascending Giants offense that's looking pretty impressive under Jackson Dart. And Cam gets another matchup against the Eagles in week 8, who he just shredded for 3 touchdowns and 31 fantasy points 2 weeks ago. Kind of crazy that they already face off again. It's going to obviously be in Philadelphia for this one, but I think he should have success again against the Eagles, who still struggle to stop the run as they are allowing the 8th most fantasy points to running backs this season. I will say the only difference here, it's a big difference, is Jalen Carter, defensive tackle for the Eagles, will be active in this one. He was not active last week. So we'll see how that pans out for Skatteboo, but regardless, you're starting him. You feel really good about it, and I do think he has another big game. That's all I have for you guys today. I really appreciate each and every one of you watching this video, engaging with the content. If you enjoy what we're doing here, if you could please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.